Hello, Ashley, and thank you for joining me today. I'm Fotis Mystakopoulos, a project policy officer at Opera's Research Infrastructure. My work focuses on open science and responsible research assessment, particularly through European initiatives such as Skills for EOSC and GRASP-OS. I also contribute to the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, where I'm involved in working groups that help translate assessment reform principles into practical guidance for institutions and researchers. And more recently, I became an ASAP Bio Fellow, collaborating on a project exploring how preprints are recognized and valued by different stakeholder communities. That's why I'm really excited about our conversation today. You are here to help us understand the funder perspective. But before we jump into the main questions, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Fantastic. I'm Ashley Farley. I'm Senior Officer of Knowledge and Research Services at the Gates Foundation, and I've been there for a decade working on our open access policy and associated initiatives. And by background, I'm a librarian, so it's very much the perspective I bring is that knowledge should be openly available for everyone.
Amazing. Before I go into some questions I have prepared for you, what you just mentioned made me curious. Could you describe the bigger picture, for example, how preprints were viewed before you joined the foundation and how things have evolved since then?
Yeah, so I joined the foundation right when the first open access policy was initiated and launched. That was back in 2015. And I think at that time, preprints weren't talked about at all. And I was also very new to academic publishing, to open access in general. I don't think there was any discussion around preprints at that time. And then, we shifted the policy over the years. We joined Coalition S, that again, funder collaboration group, no focus really on preprints other than encouraging them. But during that time, I definitely started to see discussions around preprints shift a lot, and especially with COVID, I think, we always point to that as a great example of where preprints really, stepped in where needed to get information available quickly. To the last, like 5 years, we've been kind of evaluating the whole decade of our open access policy. I've overall been a champion of preprints, but I will say earlier on in my career, I was still kind of a bit, nervous around the early sharing. You hear the constant like, but they're not peer reviewed. They're not peer reviewed. What about misinformation? And I think for a long time, I really did believe kind of the hesitation around preprints. But after, I'd say at least 8 years of our policy experience and seeing our spend on APCs to achieve open access, seeing really the overreach of especially commercial publishers, because part of Plan S, we had rights retention. So we're trying to encourage our grantees to share their author accepted manuscripts. We saw how hard that was to actually achieve. We saw publishers forcing grantees to pay APCs to achieve open access. So that really shifted my thinking of like, the preprint is kind of the last vestige of the article that authors really have full control over. And I'd say too, at that time, as we were crafting our now current policy, leadership, especially our executive sponsor, Trevor Mundell, he's the president of Global Health at the foundation, really is a big proponent of preprints, and that's how he gets most of his information, and he's really active in preprinting, so that helped leadership get on board as well.
I think when you were describing this situation, it made me think about how everything in scientific communication and in scholarly publishing more broadly is systemic. There are so many different cogs in the machine that all have to work together to make this happen. And as you said, it is often something external, in this case COVID and the pandemic, that triggers this kind of change. Hopefully, in the future, we will have fewer of these disruptive triggering events and instead move towards the right solutions before we are forced to by circumstances like that. But since you mentioned the foundation, you also highlighted that it has been a front runner in promoting openness in research. From what I have seen in the past few years, you have consistently been a bit ahead of the curve with your policies. So the point here, as I said earlier, is to explore the thinking behind that move and the broader implications it has for research assessment, funding, and of course, the research ecosystem as a whole. So to begin with, could you tell me how preprints are currently recognized within the Gates Foundation's own funding and assessment processes? For example, when you're reviewing grant applications or evaluating progress, how do preprints factor into the picture alongside peer-reviewed publications?
Yeah, I'm happy to share that. And I'd say As a private foundation, we, I think, manage grants much different than maybe a national fund or anything like that. So we don't typically do external calls or RFIs or it's very much, we have program staff that are also experts in these topics in their own rights and coming from, the sectors, academia, things like that, that have the networks, and then they're wanting to solve a problem. So they are approaching organizations, individuals, researchers to submit a proposal is typically how that works. And so we don't require like bio sketches of researchers. It's very much focused on the research itself. So building that narrative, and that's where we typically see either papers or preprints cited, but we're not evaluating on like a list of publications or an author's bio sketch. It's very much focused, at least for the grant proposal part, on like what is the research narrative? What are they trying to solve? What is their path to get there? And that often includes, and they can include cited preprints, which actually makes the most sense because we're trying to solve issues on the cutting edge. So, I don't see a lot of research that's very old being cited in these proposals because we are trying to take different approaches or fund something that's a bit different to get to a solution during the grant process. We encourage, especially, I think it's another way that the nature of and the speed of preprinting comes in handy is for citation within grant progress reports or even end of stage. So you're not waiting years for publication to come out of a grant. I mean, to be kind of completely honest, like from the foundation perspective, like the current publishing system is too slow, really, for a lot of our needs. So once, grants are closed or the projects are done, we're not waiting for the publication to come out. Like we're looking at the data, we're looking for the fastest published information to make informed decisions moving forward. So preprints can be used and recognized in kind of any of those stages. But recognizing that we are a bit unique and we're not doing, I think, traditional kind of researcher assessment based off of those metrics.
This is very interesting because when you say that the current system is too slow, especially when you're working on the cutting edge, it makes me think about the fundamental question. What is the point of publishing something? For what purpose is it being done? We see the narrative in universities and academia where researchers need publications to get promoted, they need to accumulate citations, increase their H index, or publish in a specific journal with a certain impact factor. And that process might take a couple of years. By that point, perhaps the research has already become a little outdated. I do not want to make that claim too strongly, but it is a possibility. What I find fascinating in what you said is that earlier stages of research, the data, preliminary findings, or methods can also be extremely relevant. And this is really what open science aims to do, to make more parts of the research process visible rather than focusing only on the end product, the article that appears after many years of work. While the work is happening is often where the cutting edge truly is. So I think the perspective you shared is very interesting, and thank you very much for explaining it in that way. And of course, the talk of the town nowadays is open access and specifically your policy on preprints. Could you walk me through how that policy came about and what practical steps you have taken to implement it? Related to that, what evidence do you use to make the case that preprints are the right direction for the foundation? I think many people listening would find it useful to understand what makes the argument convincing, because very often decisions like this require demonstrating why it is the best path forward. And you have already mentioned a few aspects, but specifically regarding the policy, any additional details would be very helpful.
Yeah, and I had to expand on some of the points that I mentioned earlier. But I think the two things that we kind of looked at is what was the impact that we were actually achieving with the current policy and the current policy trajectories that we've taken and kind of what we're trying to achieve. I mean, I think it's very broad to say that we want, open access to become the norm. That's a very big and lofty goal, but I think it's, what all funders are trying to work towards, and specifically starting with their own a subset of research. So we looked at that. Another really important component to the foundation is equity. So a lot of evaluation of the equity piece, where we've seen over the past decade, We get emails on a daily basis from unfunded authors needing help paying for APCs. We aren't able to step in and help with that, but we do see that it's an equitable part of the ecosystem right now and want to change that overall. We know that, even our grantees, no matter where they are in the world, are, privileged to be our grantees, and that meant that they had their APCs covered, but that really wasn't fixing the system. And then the third thing that we looked at is, our overall spend and our spend to achieve open access. And, we publish around, 4,500 papers per year, and it would cost around $6 million to make those open access. These are typically, papers that are published in more expensive journals overall. So that's a contributing factor, but it's just what, impact are we getting for that amount of money? Other than, yes, a lot of articles open access, which is great. And I think it's been hard to always assess the impact of open access since, research publications are such a unique artifact. We know that there are benefits to it, but when we were looking at kind of the impact of how the policy was working over the past decade, we were seeing where we were getting stuck. And those around elements like price transparency, understanding the true cost of publishing, getting commercial publishers to engage and share data and have more of an understanding of, does it cost $13,000 USD to make an article open access? We weren't getting anywhere in those projects. There's a lot of interesting stuff that we've kicked off with other funders and groups around price transparency that just never gained momentum. We're never seeing kind of a downward pressure on APCs. We just saw the costs continue to rise. I think I mentioned before, we had rights retention. So that was something that we were hoping would be kind of stopgap measure in achieving a no hybrid journal APC. Was okay, you can still publish where you need to publish. We know, as you mentioned, most of our grantees want to publish in specific journals for career advancement and our readership, but usually what I hear is I need to publish in that journal for my career. So we wanted to, not be a barrier to that, but we also want to change the system, and we don't want to perpetrate hybrid and expensive open access publishing. But then we had the difficulties and saw the difficulties of grantees trying to comply with that. And I think, while rights retention is incredibly important, and there's been a lot of movements to strengthen it, especially in European countries and institutions, at least here in the US, we haven't seen much meaningful progress, or at least having it tested legally so that we can tell our grantees, go ahead and share that AAM no matter what you've signed with the publisher. So that made it really hard. And so kind of those data points and then seeing our spend, it was really, I think, looking at all of this information, data, experiences, was really good and shifts, in perceptions around preprints. Also, there's been not a lot, there should be a lot more, but we had some really good research around, what really changes in a preprint from preprint posting to the final version of record. I think we're starting to see that there can be a lot more trust in the different versions, or at least in the preprint version. So all of that we kind of combined was like, what would be a policy shift that can help us get towards our intended goals that we've wanted to all along. And the beauty of preprints is it doesn't cost reader or author, so that we are able to really shift into like, okay, here's an option that we know grantees can do kind of no matter what. So they can post a preprint. That shouldn't be a barrier or issue there, as we've seen with other parts of the policy in the past. And then we are then able to make a radical shift in how we spend for open access publishing and stopping the APCs and making a pretty, I think, big statement there that we want to shift to something else.
I want to mention something that came to my mind while you were talking about readership. When I do my own scouting of topics around open science, I never find a single journal that fully covers everything relevant to the discussion, especially in the digital environment we are experiencing now. With persistent identifiers and increasing interoperability across systems also, information can move across platforms and we can search through many different engines. I find it much easier now to collect information from multiple places. It is never just one journal, let's say, where you find an entire issue focused specifically on a topic. At least in my experience, it does not work like that anymore, and that is, of course, my personal view. Yes, there are certain journals like, let's say, scientometrics or bibliometrics that are very topic specific, and you would naturally publish there if your work is in those areas. But still, at the end of the day, do people really read an entire issue or an entire journal from start to finish? Or do we find our information in a different way nowadays? And if that is the case, then preprints do have a different role and place within the whole ecosystem.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and it probably depends on discipline. I think it also depends a lot on what generation you're in. I do see a lot of researchers that will still look at the table of contents and follow those, or we'll only look at a few sources. Not saying it's the best way to information seek nowadays. I would even say at this point, there are too many papers published that it's hard for any one human to keep track of anything, and things are becoming more and more cross-disciplinary. So you really need to be looking at a lot of things. I mean, personally, from my librarian opinion, I think the article in the journal as a container of information is very archaic, and that we have technology to really change that, but it's like the systemic way that we've always published, that we've continued to do this. Um, yeah, and I do hope discoverability of preprints helps. I think the problem there that we need to address is a lot of the indexers do not include preprints because they're not peer reviewed, and the kind of, I think, too much power indexing can have on that discoverability is something that needs to be addressed. But if you're using, like Google Scholar to search, I think and I think, I'm trying to get researchers to build up that muscle of, like, if you find a paywalled article, like, check and see if it's pre-printed, and we should be able to make that system flow a lot easier. But I think that it will change drastically over the next few years as we see people leverage AI more and more, and kind of the ChatGPT and deep research. And I think people are leveraging those tools a lot more, and readership will look different. And I think when researchers talk about readership of their articles, they're looking a lot to at kind of the standard metrics of, like, how many downloads did it get, and that is kind of happening at the journal article home base and not more broadly. It might not even, actually equate to true readership or citation, but
I will tell you a fun fact. I have Google Scholar alerts set for certain authors whose work I follow closely because they are active in my own research area. And a lot of the time, Google Scholar picks up on not only their publications, but also articles related to the topics they write about. And 9 out of 10 times, those are preprints. It is amazing. I could definitely do a more thorough statistical analysis, but based on my experience, the majority of what comes through are OSF preprints, either from MetaArchive or SocArchive, because my topics are meta science, open science, and the social sciences. And this is where many people now publish their early work, just as you said. So yes, that is the fun fact of the day. With that in mind, I wanted to ask, have you, as a funder, received any criticism from your authors regarding the decision not to fund APCs? And how are you navigating those discussions?
Yeah. That has been probably the most contentious shift, because we're also not including it in grant agreements either. And there's a couple different elements that we hear. Some are concerned that it will, lessen the impact or the reach of open access publishing. So if we have more of the version of record behind a paywall, because we allow it in hybrid journals now, as long as it's pre-printed, that a lot of people feel like that's a step backwards. A lot of research, they're very used to having these things covered, and that's kind of a hard shift. And I'm amazed that publication plans for the research will come before the research is even done at all. So we had to get ahead of kind of those things. There's also the argument that it is more inequitable because we do have LMIC researchers that don't have other funding. So we kind of see the dynamic, which, is a larger issue, I think, in research and research funding in general, is you have the well-funded labs that are going to be able to produce the papers that are going to get published in the high impact journals, and they're going to have other funding and other supports to publish. open access. Those would be the institutions that have like transformative agreements with the publishers that they can tap into. And then we'll have the LMIC authors that won't have any other support or services, that'll have to maybe rely on waivers if they want to publish in certain open access journals. So that's an issue that we face, and there's no great answer for it other than that's exactly what we're trying to solve for. And I truly believe that there's not more money coming into the system, nor do I think there should be for publishing, but we dramatically need it to shift in where it's going, and the only way to do that is to, I think, stop. We've historically paid the major commercial publishers millions and millions every year for open access publishing. We do have an agreement and a grant with PLOS, so our grantees continue to publish there without facing APCs. It's kind of like more of a like TA agreement for open publishing, because that is, an important and a good nonprofit partner for the foundation. So our grantees can continue to publish there. But otherwise, yeah, it's hard to I think change that perception and behavior. And grantees are used to it and want to publish in certain journals. They're not used to considering the financial barrier at all. And now that they do, it's changing the way they approach things.
I don't think that with authors and researchers you will ever get one position that satisfies everyone. But as you described, depending on where you live and where you work, there will always be some part of the system that does not work for you. And that is inevitable. At least in my corner of the world, it also feels like the right thing to do to move away from paying APCs. It is not only about sustainability in the financial sense, whether we can continue to pay APCs indefinitely, for example. There is also the idea reflected, for example, in the Berlin Declaration that there is enough money in the system to make a full transition to open access. But I think that so far we have not chosen the right path forward. The focus has too often been on the commercial aspect, as you described. And I think that is part of the reason why at Operas, and this is where my interest in Preprints also comes from, we are looking at Diamond as a publishing model. It offers a different perspective. When it comes to money in publishing, my understanding is that there is increasingly little willingness to keep investing in models like APCs. But at the same time, we still need to maintain what researchers see as valuable for them and for scholarly communication. So in terms of uptake, have you seen a shift? Are researchers publishing more? Have you noticed any change in the number of preprints that the organization's authors are posting?
Yeah. So when we did a landscape analysis, and I think this is one of the reasons why we've held off a bit on preprint policies, because our preprint numbers were so low. So only about 10% of our overall output per year has been preprinted ahead of time. So that's very small, but it's still somewhere to start. And I think I feel very passionately about policy and the power of policy. And when, before we, encouraged use of preprints and preprinting, that's not going to move the needle much. We'll have the researchers that are on the cutting edge of open, research and doing things differently who will preprint, but we won't get the numbers up at all. So I think, shifting into mandating it will definitely begin to improve the numbers, and it's something that we are tracking. We've had, I think, quite a few grantees. So we're only, 8 months into the new policy, but grantees that have never preprinted before that are preprinting now. You might have seen that we launched Verichive, which is kind of a preprint server on top of Gates Open Research, which we launched in 2016. Really just giving grantees an option. So kind of no matter what, they have a place that they can preprint, no matter discipline or article type. So try to make it as easy as possible for them to comply. And so we're seeing good numbers there. Of course, other preprint servers are aligned with the policy as well. And we've been working closely to improve tracking. I think tracking for the funded outputs is one of the biggest barriers that we're trying to improve upon this year. So if preprint servers don't require a funding acknowledgement, it's hard for us to track. We actually don't track outputs in our grant management system very well. So when we talk about PIDs and DOIs and tracking of all these things, there's a lot of room for improvement there. And so we're working on how we can best capture all of the preprints as they're happening within the ecosystem. And then, yeah, I'm excited to see by the end of the year, kind of, we started at 10% compliance rate. Like, where are we in the end of this year? We'll be excited to see.
This is interesting. I have a quick question though. Is there a reporting platform at the Gates Foundation where researchers report their outputs? I'm thinking of Horizon Europe, for example, where you must report publications and the system can tell from the DOI whether something is open access or not, for example. Do you have a similar platform where you expect people to report their outputs or not?
For the grant reporting aspect, like we have our own bespoke internal reporting. And if these outputs were like required deliverables to the grant, that'll be better tracked than just our open access policy in general.
Okay.
And then we partner with OA Works, which is a really great nonprofit partner of ours that's helping us improve the tracking of the outputs. So separate from our grant management system, like we know there's preprints out there that we funded. How do they find them and kind of bring that in? And that's kind of our reporting and compliance tracking for the open access policy. But it's a little bit, it's always something I'm trying to prove upon is how do we kind of connect the two of our grant management system and then our reporting for the OA policy. But right now they're kind of separate.
Thank you very much, Ashley. The next topic I would like to discuss relates to trust and credibility concerns. We touched on this earlier. You mentioned that even you had some doubts when you first started engaging with the topic of preprints. How does the Foundation address concerns that unreviewed findings could be misunderstood or misused? And linked to that, what mechanisms do you think can help build trust in preprints without undermining their rapid and open nature? What I would mostly like to focus on here is the unreviewed aspect, whether that is perceived as a real issue, because there is also the published review curate model, right? A kind of preprint to curation pathway where research is shared early and then receives review and additional validation over time. So what I want to understand is, as a foundation and as a funder, especially since you noted that senior leadership is supportive, have you had internal discussions about these concerns? Do you consider them a non-issue? Or do you have specific trust indicators or signals you pay attention to? I would love to hear a bit more about how this conversation has evolved within the foundation.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest parts of the discussion is, this is at least for the foundation, like our policy and requiring our funded research be pre-printed first. And so understanding that we've gone through an immense amount of work and due diligence in creating the grant to begin with, and that partnership with the grantee, that we have a very high level of trust of the published output. Of course, that's not perfect, but we did some research on like our previous like retraction rates and such of funded research was very, very small. I found like less than a handful of articles that have been Gates funded that have been retracted based off of the data that's available. So we have a high level of trust there. We do have it written to our policy that if the preprint goes through traditional journal peer review and there's major changes to kind of the conclusion, that the preprint should be updated or flagged within at least a year between kind of preprint to publication. It's hard to adjust that, and I will admit that it's going to be hard to enforce as well. But we thought it was important to at least include a nod to that we want researchers to be updating things if there are major differences between the two. Again, we've looked at the research that's starting to help us, understand that there aren't maybe huge differences. And then I also think we've been having a lot more robust discussions around what current or traditional peer review is not achieving nowadays. And I think there's even more data building up on that side of like, we've put a lot of blind faith into the current system. And there's a lot of evidence showing that that isn't the case. I've also become much more of a believer that not everything needs to be peer reviewed. We do fund a lot of research and clinical trials and things like that, but also a lot of what our funding is not more in the research and academic space, and like those outputs might not need to, if they want to get published and disseminated, don't need the same level of scrutiny as other research. So so there's a lot of discussions around kind of, is current peer review achieving it? What could it look like differently? And then we are learning a lot from our experiences with the Verichive platform, which is doing more checks than kind of a traditional preprint server might. And then we can have some data and see, yes, it takes a little bit longer to publish that preprint, maybe a month, versus a couple of days? What are we gaining? What are we losing in that time? Are the checks and additional checks doing what we want them to? And then also just in general, we're trying to really improve data availability statements and availability of the underlying data because that's, I think, really what's needed to have trust in the research article and conclusions itself. Um, I like the saying, otherwise it's just an advertisement for the work. And so we're trying to improve that, but that's open or manage and share data is a much steeper hill to climb.
I see your points, and my next question would be around assessment and metrics, although I'm not sure if we have already covered much of this. I'm wondering whether you have a system or approach for assessing the quality and impact of a preprint. And as you mentioned earlier, it is already difficult to assess the impact of an open access publication more broadly, particularly when we think about the real difference a paper makes in terms of policy or societal outcomes. So I believe that we have touched on this topic, but if there's anything else you would like to add in terms of how you assess preprints or research impact more generally, I would be really interested to hear it.
We've seen a lot, I think there is a part of the ecosystem that's trying to be like, okay, if we're not measuring papers and citations, like what do we measure? How do we make different metrics? There's a lot of interesting work there. I think it's hard. I think human behavior is really hard. And part of me is always like, I don't like just, especially, I think it's a librarian perspective too. Like, I just want the research to be out there available so it can be consumed and used, whatever. When we see things around policy changes, uh, that's, I think, hugely impactful when some process actually changes or some thing is created. But other than that, I don't think at this point that's the biggest area to focus on right now.
I think I'm going to offer something a little bit different from the discussion around preprints. I have been having a lot of discussions around pre-registrations and registered reports recently, and it made me think, when talking about early dissemination, about the examples I have had from a colleague who works in psychology. She explained to me a little bit how the process works. And what I found fascinating is the idea that once you get your protocol or methodology approved or published, then you are committed to publishing your results either way, regardless of whether you have positive results. Because this also speaks to what we think publication should be about. It is not just about success in the sense of I achieved something significant or I made an innovation here. The point is that everyone is doing research, and even negative results or a hypothesis that did not lead somewhere may also be useful to share. But this is not currently valued, right? And so my question is, do you see a future, and maybe we're moving in a slightly different direction here, so please consider this a parenthesis, where open access policy looks more seriously at different models of publication like this one? What is your perspective on how things might move forward?
I think that would be fantastic. Again, it does go back to my point of like, I think the journal and the journal article as a container of information is not fit for our purposes and how research actually works anymore. But because that's what's measured and counted, that's what the focus is on. And I don't know how this will, I hope it happens within my career and lifetime that we see the academic career incentive really shift and stop being a barrier to really innovation in this space because we've done a lot of work over the past decade trying to get researchers to share knowledge results, and I am a major proponent of like micro publishing, so we did some work there and trying to encourage it. Maybe, I mean, we could maybe have stronger policy requiring it. Although I would foresee we get a lot of pushback because since it doesn't kind of count, researchers are very, very reluctant to spend any more time kind of disseminating that information in any structured way, even when we tried to make that structure as easy as possible. We just didn't see the uptake that we would like. And of course that's a very generalized statement. We do have researchers and grantees that we work with that are very motivated and do take the time to share null results, but they also, and this is why I think preprint and preprint servers will become even more important, is they really struggled to find a place to just publish it. And so they'd had it ready to go, but if it wouldn't go in more of a traditional journal, they're like, where do I put this thing? And now, we can definitely say preprints would be an option. And I think preprints servers will need to become more inclusive in the future and more flexible in kind of the article types or shapes of information that they will take, because researchers need a platform to be able to share this.
You mentioned whether it is something that is counted, and I think this leads directly into my next point about incentives. So my question is, if we move toward a more dominant model where preprints are more present, or at least if we imagine an alternative future where preprints become much more common, what could future research assessment look like? I do not know if you have a specific vision for this, but what would you see as a positive direction? What would be beneficial for the research community in that regard? And how would you incentivize people to engage more actively with preprints?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I have a great answer for that. I mean, I would like to think that there's a way that, if you're kind of, I don't like the word like producing because it seems so like turn out the machine of information, but at least if you're making it available, it can be ingested in different things. I mean, I think, it's hard to ignore how so much of this information that's available is going to be hoovered up into the LLMs, and I've heard somebody kind of mention, can you capture that as a score of like my work was cited in, deep research outputs and things like that. Would that heighten it? I've also seen some work around, kind of creating a novelty score that can work in different ways where, if you're what you've shared, whether positive, negative results, moved something in a certain direction, that's important. I think it's just hard to, because the current system is so like individualistic, but that's not how research works anymore, or at least shouldn't work. And these are large labs of people, or large groups of people, or even small groups of people, or still teams of people doing this globally. I would love to see something more of, and I know there's been a little work, but it's hard, like a more of a collaboration score, like, or how you engage with other researchers, share information. I know there are a lot of people too would like to see more of a mentorship score, like that makes a difference when you're reviewing somebody for promotion and tenure, like what are the communities that they build and help support, because I think that's really um how research keeps moving forward.
I think you summarized the situation very well. Preprints, or publishing more generally, represent only a small percentage of what people actually do. And this connects with the broader discussions we are having in open science and research assessment. It is not sufficient to value someone solely on publications. You mentioned big team science, large collaborations where people contribute many small things or sometimes very substantial things within complex research activities. It is so hard to quantify individual contributions, even to separate them meaningfully from the collective work sometimes. And it can feel unfair to evaluate someone entirely as an individual rather than as a part of a team. So when you said earlier that's a great question, I realized that even as I was looking at my notes to ask about future assessment systems, it is probably not a question for a 1 hour podcast. It is a much bigger conversation. So more specifically, have initiatives like Dora or Koara influenced your thinking or direction in these discussions around preprints?
Yeah. I mean, we're signatories. We're not part of Quora yet. But yeah, I think it's really important work to highlight the issues, and kind of like it's still important to keep asking that question. It's really important to be able to have kind of that format to have the discussion, especially with program staff. It's something I would like to see the foundation take on, maybe more aggressively in solutions. And there's a lot of opportunities there as we choose, partners that we work with. So, I try to educate program staff of making sure that we find values aligned partner, and a lot of that we can point to. Are they a DORA signatory? Are they not? Have we had those discussions? And so it's really great framework to be able to have those important discussions. I think there's a lot more we could do to try and move the needle. But we're also through like the Open Research Funders group and Helios. There's a lot of connections there, and we know kind of the research assessment has always been the greatest barrier to change in the space for many different reasons, not just open access publications, but also more robust data sharing, and getting to solutions and innovations much faster, because that's one of the things that was amazing to see during the pandemic. we had open science kind of ideals that we've been trying to reach for a long time, but had a lot of pushback, both internally, externally. And then, those kind of went to the wayside when it's like, we need to share information, we need to share data, it has to be done. And we have plenty of crises, I think, at the similar urgency as the pandemic. So we know it's possible. That was a little bit off topic with the original question, but
No, not at all. I don't think that it was off topic in terms of the original question. I think that trying to isolate one issue such as preprints from the rest of the research activities is not possible, especially when we're talking about open science. I also think it highlights the point that the value of preprints lies exactly in that broader context. We cannot focus all our efforts on maintaining journals simply for the sake of maintaining journals. Instead, it is important, and this is a discussion happening among many researchers, to distribute our time and energy in ways that demonstrate the full breadth of our research rather than concentrating only on publishing a couple of articles a year because this is what institutions incentivize. And I think the way you describe this is very valuable. So, two small questions. Do you provide any training or support for your grantees regarding preprints, or do you plan to do something like that in the future, or do you not think it is necessary?
no, I think it's very necessary. I think we're in the early stages of what that can look like, and we can leverage. I think the biggest support we have right now is if they do choose to publish on Verichive, there's trainings and supports there. We could definitely do something that's more broad for the other preprint servers, but we're always available to answer any questions and talk through the process. And then we've done a couple partnerships and funding around like the group pre-review, which is great. And so it's broader than just our grantees, but training and peer review, and then also really advocating for peer review of preprints. And then rapid reviews infectious disease is another one. And so those are kind of community groups that help, I think, in broader training and advocacy of preprints, not just focused on our grantees. And most of the programs and things I'm trying to build up, not just for our grantees, but any researcher anywhere, I think is important when we talk about equity, is that's just not our grantees. But we always offer any supports they need.
Excellent. So you mentioned very key briefly. Could you tell me a bit about the platforms developed by the Gates Foundation? How do you feel about them and how are you managing the process? What is your overall takeaway from these activities?
Yeah, so we launched Gates Open Research in 2016, and that was really like a moment in time to kind of put our name behind a different idea of publishing, which is much more that the publish, review, curate. So it's a fully open post-publication peer-reviewed platform, which is what I believe we should be headed, is more of larger platforms, publishing activities and added things, services to that, versus, kind of the more journal, smaller level, all of that. But it's given me a really good opportunity to really speak and learn from our grantees, ones that do want to publish on there, ones that don't, why they don't, kind of what the experiences are, the barriers that we have. Like the platform's never had an impact factor, and that's something that still comes up frequently when people are looking to publish there. How does the open peer review go? The rest of this year, I hope to focus more on producing some preprints or research of our own based off of, the decade of data that we have. And that's why we kind of pivot to Verichive, because it kind of decouples, if people think that they have a paper that they can publish in Science or, Nature, or one of the top tier journals, they're not going to publish it on Gates Open Research. So now we're encouraging them to preprint that on the platform, and then they can still go submit it wherever they want, but we're not paying an APC to make it open access at this point anymore. So it has taught me a lot about researchers' perspectives. Again, we also tried through these platforms to really promote sharing and publishing of different results. That's had little uptick because of, researcher time and attention is always limited. But I do, I think it's important. We've supported a lot of researchers that wouldn't have had support anywhere to get their information out, and it's been a really rewarding experience to have something to offer. So I think those are going well. I think they're important to have. It's good to always have, I think, a solid alternative to journal publishing.
I think what you're doing is commendable. At some point, you have to decide to stop working in a direction you do not agree with, as in the APC model. So, one final small question, and thank you again. This has been very insightful. Is there a single most important step that funders, institutions, or the broader research community can take to accelerate the acceptance and use of preprints? What advice would you give to someone, whether a funder, an institution, or part of the academic community, who wants to help advance preprints from their side?
The biggest thing is, the small steps you can do to normalize the practice. So preprinting yourself, reading and sharing preprints. I often will share, a preprint versus a paywalled version of record, like making those more of a standard practice, I think, go a long way. For funders, I've been working on a project, and we'll be doing more of this in the next year. But Creative Commons, Gates, and Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, we produced the preprint framework for policymakers and funders, and highly encourage everyone to take a look at that. It has kind of recommendations of, not every funder can have a strong policy or mandate. I truly believe that's the only way to kind of make progress in this space. And I think having a preprint policy at this current stage in the ecosystem is going to be the most affordable, most equitable, easiest policy to put in place and enforce that'll have the biggest impact. So when you're talking about open access policy in this point, I think there's really low barrier for any funder to enter into having a preprint policy, and that'll have a huge positive effect on the ecosystem. And then, yeah, just anyone else, I think, using preprints, talking about them, sharing them, normalizing that more is going to go a long way.
This is perfect. Thank you very much, Ashley, for your time today, for joining us, and for sharing your perspective, of course. I'm sure that when we share this conversation, people will appreciate it and take away a lot from what you have discussed. I hope to see you again at other open science events, preprints or otherwise. And once again, thank you very much for joining us today. And I hope to everyone listening that you've enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you for the opportunity.